The history of the Second World War has been written, rewritten, and sanctified into the textbooks of victorious nations. Yet beneath the glossy accounts of battlefield heroism and speeches of defiance lies a catalogue of horrors deliberately buried, classified reports sealed in Soviet vaults, intercepted Gestapo files stamped Vernichtung in red ink, and American intelligence memoranda marked Eyes Only tell a far darker story than the public was ever permitted to see. These are not the familiar tales of tanks grinding across the steppes or bombers blotting out the sky. These are the forbidden histories. The accounts so grotesque and destabilizing that governments chose silence over disclosure. Between the lines of official communiques and trial transcripts lie unrecorded terrors. Civilians who descended into primal survival in besieged cities, prisoners transformed into experimental specimens by men in white coats who pledged allegiance to empire, and political prisoners dissected in laboratories of death where survival was never the purpose. The shifting alliances of the Cold War further obscured these truths, as victorious powers sanitized records to shield themselves from accusations of complicity. Yet fragments survive: a torn interrogation log, a blurred photograph smuggled in a soldier's kit, a coded telegram never fully decrypted. Each piece a reminder that the real history of the war was not victory parades and flags, but human suffering so profound that even those who unearthed it feared its revelation. Tonight, those long-silenced files are reopened, their voices rising again from beneath the weight of 7 decades of secrecy. Chapter 1. The Cannibal Camps of Leningrad Siege in September 1941. The Wehrmacht's Army Group North encircled the Soviet city of Leningrad, initiating what would become one of the longest and most brutal sieges in modern warfare. Cut off from supply lines, its 3 million residents found themselves trapped in a nightmare that blurred the boundaries between military struggle and human extinction. Official Soviet propaganda portrayed the city's ordeal as a testament to endurance, resilience, and unbreakable loyalty to Stalin and the motherland. Yet beneath the soaring rhetoric and carefully censored reports, a darker reality unfolded in the city's frozen streets and crumbling apartment blocks. NKVD file S347, sealed for decades within Soviet archives, documents an epidemic of cannibalism that took hold as famine tightened its grip. These reports, typed in the bureaucratic language of internal security, describe citizens arrested for corpse harvesting, parents executed for child hunting, and entire households condemned for butchery carried out under the cover of blackouts and artillery fire. The first winter of the siege was the most catastrophic. German bombardments had destroyed food depots, and the Baltic blockade severed all external supply routes. Bread rations, already meager, were cut to 125 grams per person. By late December 1941, little more than a handful of blackened crust, bulked with sawdust and cellulose. Diaries recovered from the period speak of families boiling wallpaper paste, grinding leather into broth, or stripping bark from trees. Yet even these desperate measures could not stave off starvation. Soviet secret police patrols began to encounter mutilated corpses in stairwells, sometimes missing limbs, sometimes stripped of flesh. In NKVD memoranda, such cases were recorded clinically. Subject apprehended with remains of minor confessed to consumption. Punishments were immediate and merciless. Execution squads shot offenders in courtyards at dawn, often in front of horrified neighbors, as a deterrent. Still, the phenomenon spread. The German intelligence services, the Abwehr and SD, monitored the descent closely. Smuggled photographs retrieved from aerial reconnaissance missions depict emaciated figures dragging lifeless bodies through the snow, skeletal shadows against the ruins of the city. German reports referred to the population as living dead, and propaganda leaflets dropped over Leningrad sought to exploit the despair, urging surrender by highlighting the starvation within. Yet the Soviets maintained an iron grip on information, suppressing any mention of cannibalism in official communique. Survivors later recalled how neighbors vanished overnight, families disappeared without explanation, and whispers spread through apartment blocks of children being traded in shadow markets. Evidence suggests that entire basements were converted into slaughter dens, where those too weak to resist were killed for food. The NKVD, overwhelmed and underfed themselves, often destroyed evidence after executions to prevent panic. What survives are fragmented depositions, grimly catalogued in secret files. The winter of 1942 compounded the catastrophe. Temperatures plunged below -30 degrees Celsius, freezing corpses into rigid statues across the streets. Electricity was gone, heating failed, and water had to be hacked from frozen rivers under constant shellfire. Hunger transformed the human body. Skin grayed, eyes sank, and muscles atrophied until movement itself became unbearable. The human mind followed. Psychiatrists who later studied the siege described how hunger dismantled morality, stripping away cultural norms until only primal instinct remained. Parents, driven mad by the cries of their children, turned against them. Neighbors ambushed one another in stairwells. NKVD squads reported entire households where the living coexisted with the butchered remains of their kin, unwilling or unable to abandon the only sustenance available. Soviet propaganda continued to paint the city as unbroken, issuing posters proclaiming, "Leningrad will not fall," even as its residents consumed each other in silence. One particularly haunting file, declassified only after the Soviet collapse, describes a woman named Tatiana, arrested with the remains of her 12-year-old son. In interrogation, she admitted to killing him after her youngest daughter had already starved to death. Her testimony, typed in cold bureaucratic prose, ended with the line, "I loved him. I had no choice." Tatiana was executed the following morning. Such confessions were not anomalies. They formed a hidden pattern, one systematically denied by Soviet officials during and after the war. Even during the post-war famine investigations of 1946, when internal Soviet reports acknowledged mass starvation across several regions, Leningrad's cannibalism files were deliberately excluded. The myth of resilience had to remain untarnished. The Germans, though besieging the city, never fully comprehended the scale of this internal collapse. Their objective, outlined in directive from Hitler dated September 29, 1941, was the total annihilation of Leningrad through starvation, denying any responsibility for its civilian population. The Wehrmacht's own situation reports noted the gradual success of this strategy. The city is dying. Surrender unnecessary. Yet they underestimated the Soviet will to conceal the truth. Stalin himself ordered that Leningrad be portrayed only as a fortress of defiance, punishing any officials who allowed reports of cannibalism to reach the foreign press. Thus, the reality was hidden not only from the outside world, but also from many within the Soviet Union itself. When the blockade finally broke in January 1944, survivors emerged as spectral remnants of humanity. The Red Army celebrated victory, parading troops through the devastated city. Yet in the shadows, NKVD units quietly purged files, destroyed photographs, and executed remaining cannibal cases to erase evidence. A generation later, the official Soviet history of the war made no mention of this nightmare. School children were taught of bread ration cards, of heroic resistance, of musicians who performed symphonies as bombs fell, never of the families who killed to eat, nor of the secret patrols who hunted them. It was only after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when archives opened briefly in the 1990s, that fragments of these horrors came to light. The siege of Leningrad remains remembered as a symbol of resilience, but the truth, buried in file S347 and the whispered testimonies of survivors, is more complex. It is a history where starvation was weaponized, where hunger erased morality, and where the human spirit, rather than simply resisting, sometimes turned against itself. Behind the triumphal marches and the symphonies of survival lies the silence of millions who endured a fate so terrible that even their liberators could not speak of it. The cannibal camps of Leningrad were not a myth, nor an isolated aberration, but a concealed reality of one of the darkest chapters of the Second World War. And though the city survived, the truth of its survival was buried in archives stamped top secret, left to rot in silence for half a century. Chapter 2. Unit 731's Human Frostbite Experiments, hidden in the frigid landscape of occupied Manchuria, far from the prying eyes of international observers. Japan's Imperial Army created one of the most notorious centers of human experimentation in history. The facility was officially known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. To outsiders, the name suggested sanitation and medical defense. In truth, the compound at Pingfang, near the city of Harbin, was the headquarters of Unit 731, a sprawling complex of laboratories, barracks, and incinerators designed for experimentation on living humans. Commanded by General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant but ruthless microbiologist, the unit pursued biological and chemical warfare research with clinical precision. Within its walls, thousands of prisoners, Chinese civilians, Soviet captives, Mongolian herders, Korean resistors, and even some Westerners, were reduced to the status of maruta, the Japanese word for logs. This code name symbolized their dehumanization, as if each subject were nothing more than raw material for data collection. Among the many horrors inflicted at Unit 731, the Frostbite experiments stand out as some of the most grotesque. In the harsh Manchurian winters, temperatures plummeted far below freezing, creating natural conditions for the Japanese scientists to test the limits of human survival. Prisoners were forcibly marched outside, their arms and legs stripped bare and doused in water, left to the merciless winds until their skin froze solid. Researchers described, with unnerving detachment, how the affected limbs stiffened, the skin turning pale and hard like wood. In some cases, the frozen flesh was struck with wooden sticks until it made a dull, hollow sound, confirming that it had crystallized. Once the frostbite had set in, doctors would attempt crude treatments, plunging the limbs into boiling water, rubbing them with salt, or amputating sections to study infection and necrosis. Every step was carefully documented, not to save lives, but to calculate thresholds of endurance and to develop guidelines for Japanese soldiers fighting in Siberian or northern Chinese climates. The records that survive, smuggled out after Japan's surrender or reconstructed from witness testimony, reveal a disturbing juxtaposition. On one page, meticulous charts detail temperature readings, the time elapsed until tissue loss, and the rate of gangrene progression. On another, hand-drawn sketches depict twisted, blackened fingers, shattered toes, and faces locked in silent screams. The language used was chillingly neutral. Subject number 37, exposure time 1 hour 12 minutes, amputation performed, mortality confirmed. The subjects themselves were never named, never acknowledged as people. They were stripped of identity, stripped of dignity, and ultimately stripped of life. Yet their suffering became data points used in the advancement of Japanese military medicine. The brutality was not confined to frostbite. Unit 731 was a hub of biological terror research, testing plague, anthrax, cholera, and other pathogens on unwilling human hosts. Infected fleas were released into villages. Reservoirs were poisoned, and entire communities were wiped out under the guise of field trials. But the frostbite experiments remained singular in their cruelty, because they weaponized not disease, but the environment itself. Cold became an instrument of torture, orchestrated by men in white coats who recorded every outcome as though dissecting a laboratory rat. Prisoners sometimes begged to be shot, rather than endure the agony of freezing. Their pleas were ignored. Death was not the purpose. Survival time, tissue reaction, and the progression of decay were. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the world might have expected these crimes to come to light during the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. Instead, much of the evidence was buried under layers of secrecy. American occupation authorities, led by General Douglas MacArthur, recognized the potential military value of Ishii's research. Rather than prosecute him and his colleagues, US intelligence struck a clandestine bargain: immunity in exchange for the experimental data. Declassified CIA and Army intelligence documents reveal how reports on frostbite endurance and biological warfare were transferred to American custody, while Unit 731's personnel faded into post-war obscurity. Ishii himself lived quietly in Japan until his death in 1959, never once facing a court of justice. His colleagues reintegrated into universities, medical schools, and corporate research labs, their past scrubbed from official records. The Soviet Union, which captured several Unit 731 personnel, conducted its own tribunal in Khabarovsk in December 1949. Unlike the Americans, the Soviets exposed many of the atrocities, with witnesses describing in detail the frostbite tests and plague experiments. The proceedings, however, were dismissed in the West as propaganda, and the testimonies remained largely ignored until decades later. For survivors, silence prevailed. Chinese families whose relatives vanished into the compound at Pingfang rarely received confirmation of their fates. Entire villages in Manchuria that had been targeted by field experiments were erased from maps, their names forgotten. Only fragments of oral testimony, whispered across generations, carried the memory of what had transpired. What makes the frostbite experiments particularly haunting is not just their cruelty, but their legacy. Documents reveal that American military researchers used the findings during the Korean War, studying frostbite injuries among US troops and comparing them with the Japanese data. The logic of the Cold War, where any advantage against the Soviet Union justified moral compromise, ensured that Unit 731's crimes were not merely hidden, but appropriated. The victims, dehumanized in life, were further erased in death, their suffering converted into assets in the superpower rivalry. To walk today among the ruins of the Pingfang complex is to feel the weight of erasure. Broken brick foundations and rusted pipes are all that remain of the laboratories where men became monsters under the guise of science. Local residents still speak of bones unearthed during construction projects, fragments of skulls and femurs rising unbidden from the frozen soil. Museums in Harbin attempt to preserve the memory, but much of the world remains unaware or unwilling to confront the reality that the victors of the Second World War willingly covered up one of its darkest atrocities. The Frostbite victims of Unit 731 were never given names, graves, or memorials worthy of their suffering. They remain anonymous spectres in the archives, reduced to numbers and graphs, their torment preserved only in files stamped top secret. The story of Unit 731's Frostbite experiments is not simply a tale of cruelty during wartime. It is a mirror reflecting the willingness of states to suppress truth in the pursuit of power. It reveals how medical science, stripped of ethics, can descend into barbarism cloaked in the language of research. And it reminds us that beneath every sanitized textbook account of the war lies a darker truth, sealed in vaults, waiting to resurface. The legacy of Frostbite at Unit 731 is not frozen in the past. It is a chilling reminder that when nations prioritize supremacy over humanity, the coldest experiments are not performed by nature, but by human hands guiding the freeze. Chapter 3. The Ravensbrück Execution Files. Unsealed Ravensbrück was unlike the other concentration camps of the Third Reich. Located north of Berlin, it was the largest women's camp in the Nazi system, designed originally to house political prisoners, but soon expanded to absorb resistance fighters, Jews, Romani, and anyone the regime deemed unfit. More than 130,000 women passed through its gates between 1939 and 1945, and tens of thousands never emerged. Official histories described Ravensbrück as a place of forced labor, starvation, and execution, which was horrifying enough. Yet declassified fragments from Gestapo file No. 17 reveal a deeper layer of hidden atrocity. A systematic program of medical experimentation where women were reduced to test subjects under the supervision of SS doctors, their fates annotated in ledgers with chilling precision. It was not a camp of simple extermination, but a laboratory of suffering, where life was prolonged only to be dissected, broken, and discarded. The experiments began under the codename Operation Sulphur in 1942, when Heinrich Himmler authorized research into the treatment of battlefield injuries using unwilling prisoners as human material. Dozens of Polish resistance fighters, captured during Gestapo raids in Warsaw, were transferred to Ravensbrück, specifically for this purpose. They became known as the Rabbits, a grim nickname referring not only to their role as experimental animals, but also to the way their mutilated legs forced them to hop painfully when they tried to walk. Surgeons deliberately shattered bones, cut into muscles, and introduced glass fragments and dirt into open wounds before attempting crude grafts and transplants. The women screamed under primitive anesthesia, if any was provided at all. Infection was not avoided, but encouraged, to test the efficacy of sulfonamide drugs. The goal was not to heal, but to measure how long a body could endure deliberate mutilation. Gestapo records describe these procedures in sterile, bureaucratic prose. Subject 52, tibial fracture inflicted, contaminated with soil sample B, antibiotic administered. Result, necrosis after 72 hours. Such sentences conceal the agony behind them, transforming flesh and blood into abstract data points. Soviet investigators who later entered the camp found discarded medical tools, blood-stained surgical gowns, and fragments of bones buried behind the infirmary. But by then, many of the files had already been smuggled out or destroyed by the retreating SS. The surviving documents are fragments, cross-reference memos, intercepted telegrams, and secret depositions taken by Allied interrogators. Together, they form a mosaic of terror hidden behind the facade of medical science. The camp's execution system was equally concealed. Officially, women sentenced to death were transported to Bernburg or Auschwitz for gassing. In reality, many were killed within Ravensbrück itself. Small gas chambers were constructed in 1944 under direct orders from Himmler, and firing squads were regularly convened in the woods nearby. Yet the most haunting records are not those of mass execution, but of selective elimination tied directly to the experiments. Women who survived multiple surgical procedures were quietly disappeared, their names erased from rolls, their remains incinerated. Gestapophile No. 17 contains lists annotated in red pencil, with chilling notes beside them, verbraucht, used up. To the SS doctors, these women were consumable resources, expended in the pursuit of knowledge. The Soviet Union publicized some of these crimes during the Nuremberg trials, but crucial details were redacted or omitted altogether. Western officials feared that too much exposure would destabilize the fragile post-war order, particularly as tensions with the Soviets deepened into the Cold War. Many of the doctors involved were never prosecuted. Herta Oberhäuser, one of the camp's chief physicians, was sentenced to 20 years but served only 5 before being released and resuming her medical practice in Germany. Survivors who tried to confront her in the 1960s were silenced or dismissed. The files detailing her involvement were scattered across Allied archives, some labeled classified until well into the 1980s. The women who endured these torments bore scars not only on their bodies but in their silence. Many of the rabbits testified in secret sessions, their accounts catalogued in Polish underground archives hidden during the communist era. They spoke of nights spent listening to the cries of women carried out of the infirmary, never to return. They described crude wooden crutches made from scrap lumber, blood seeping through rags wrapped around infected wounds, and the ever-present fear that survival was only temporary. In one testimony, a survivor recalled how a fellow prisoner, after enduring 3 experimental surgeries, whispered, "We are not patients, we are specimens." That phrase became a recurring motif in the secret depositions, a grim acknowledgement of their stolen humanity. Soviet troops liberated Ravensbrück in April 1945, discovering a camp on the brink of collapse. Thousands of skeletal survivors staggered among piles of corpses. Yet liberation did not bring clarity. The chaos of post-war Europe, the destruction of records, and the competing agendas of Allied powers all ensured that the full truth remained fragmented. Some files were seized by Soviet intelligence and locked away in KGB vaults. Others were absorbed into American and British archives, where they were quietly buried under the pretext of national security. Survivors who demanded recognition were often met with suspicion, their accounts dismissed as exaggerations. It was easier for governments to remember Ravensbrück as a camp of labor and death, not as a site of medical crimes that implicated institutions far beyond Germany's borders. The documents that do survive tell a story that is both intimate and vast. They speak of individual women, Polish students, French resistance fighters, Soviet nurses, who were mutilated in the name of science. They also speak of a system, bureaucratic and calculated, that converted human beings into experimental data. The notes in Gestapo File No. 17, the photographs hidden in Polish underground archives, and the red-penciled execution orders all testify to a reality deliberately erased from mainstream memory. These were not accidents of war, nor the actions of rogue doctors, but a sanctioned program of annihilation disguised as research. Today, the legacy of Ravensbrück's experiments survives only in fragments. Scarred survivors who carried their wounds for life, scattered archives pieced together by historians, and memorials erected decades too late. The silence that followed was not accidental. It was constructed, layer by layer, to protect reputations, preserve stability, and avoid confronting the full depth of human cruelty. The execution files of Ravensbrück, once sealed in Gestapo vaults and Soviet archives, are more than historical records. They are indictments of a system that sought to erase its victims not only in life, but in memory. And though many documents remain lost, the fragments that endure are enough to expose a hidden machinery of suffering that the world was never meant to see. Chapter 4. Operation Paperclip's Silent Atrocities. Imported as the ashes of the Third Reich cooled in 1945, a new war began before the old one was fully buried. The United States and the Soviet Union, victors on opposite sides of Europe, scrambled not only for territory but for minds, the scientists, engineers and intelligence officers who had served Hitler's regime. The Americans launched Operation Paperclip, a covert program designed to seize German expertise in rocketry, aviation and biological warfare. Officially, it was a scientific recruitment effort. In reality, it was an intelligence operation that laundered the pasts of war criminals, erasing evidence of atrocities in exchange for their cooperation. More than 1,600 individuals were brought to American soil, many with direct ties to the SS, the Gestapo, and Nazi medical programs. Their files, once stamped with swastikas and death sentences, were rewritten in Washington offices, redacted, sanitized, and marked cleared for entry. Victim testimonies disappeared into classified vaults. The same men who had once built instruments of mass death now walked free, welcomed as assets in America's new struggle against the Soviet Union. Among the most infamous beneficiaries of Paperclip was Wernher von Braun, the SS officer and engineer behind the V-2 rocket program. The V-2 was a technological marvel, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, but its construction relied on forced labor from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. Prisoners worked underground in suffocating tunnels, starved and beaten, as thousands died from exhaustion, disease, and execution. Survivors later testified that bodies were stacked in heaps beside the rocket assembly lines. Yet these testimonies were never presented when von Braun arrived in America in 1945. Instead, he was paraded as a scientific genius, his Nazi past stripped from his biography. Declassified documents from the Office of Strategic Services show how references to Mittelbau-Dora were deliberately excised from his records, replaced with glowing assessments of his technical indispensability. Within 2 decades, von Braun stood beside US presidents, celebrated as the father of NASA's Apollo program. The blood on his rockets was erased beneath the stars and stripes. Paperclip extended beyond rocketry. Files reveal that former SS physicians who conducted human experiments at Dachau and Buchenwald were quietly funneled into American military research. One such doctor, whose name remains redacted in CIA archives, had overseen hypothermia tests in which prisoners were immersed in freezing water until death, in attempts to simulate conditions faced by German pilots. Rather than face justice, he was given a new identity and assigned to study survival techniques for US airmen during the Cold War. Internal memoranda labeled "Eyes Only" justified this transfer with chilling pragmatism. Data unobtainable by ethical experimentation, essential for national security. The suffering of the victims was not only ignored but repurposed, transformed into knowledge that fueled American supremacy. The Soviets engaged in their own parallel program, seizing German scientists to bolster their nuclear and missile projects. Yet it was the Americans who perfected the art of concealment. Operation Paperclip was officially acknowledged only decades later, long after its beneficiaries had built careers, reputations, and legacies. Many lived out their lives as respected professors, engineers, and medical consultants, their connections to Nazi crimes buried in files locked deep within Pentagon archives. Even when fragments of truth surfaced, survivor testimonies, journalistic exposés, or declassified cables, the revelations were muted, dismissed, or overshadowed by Cold War paranoia. National interest again and again outweighed historical truth. The moral implications were staggering. At the Nuremberg trials, Allied prosecutors condemned Nazi doctors and officers for crimes against humanity, insisting that science without ethics was nothing more than murder cloaked in procedure. Yet even as the courtroom echoed with principles of justice, other corridors of power were preparing immunity deals and falsified dossiers. Operation Paperclip embodied this hypocrisy. Justice was selective. Guilt was negotiable. The very men who should have stood in the dock were instead escorted onto military bases, their war crimes scrubbed in the service of a new enemy. Victims' families, still searching for accountability, were told nothing. Their testimonies gathered dust in archives marked classified until 2025 or beyond. By the time details of Paperclip began leaking in the 1970s, many of its architects were dead or untouchable. Journalists uncovered fragments, cables discussing the whitewashing of SS affiliations, internal Air Force reports citing data from Dachau experiments, and letters from survivors demanding recognition. But the larger picture remained obscured, shielded by bureaucratic inertia and the reluctance of governments to tarnish their own Cold War triumphs. Even NASA's triumph, the moon landing of 1969, was shadowed by whispers that the same rockets that carried Apollo into space were born from tunnels filled with corpses. The American dream of space conquest stood on the unmarked graves of Mittelbau-Dora's dead. The story of Operation Paperclip is not merely about scientific opportunism. It is about the conscious decision to import atrocities, to convert human suffering into data, and to allow perpetrators to reinvent themselves as pioneers. It is about the silence imposed on victims whose voices were inconvenient, whose blood-stained testimonies threaten national prestige. It is about the erasure of history in real time, carried out by governments that preached freedom while bargaining with the architects of slavery and death. And it remains unfinished, because many of the files are still sealed, their details hidden behind redacted pages, their secrets buried in classified archives. What is already known is damning. What remains concealed may be darker still. Operation Paperclip stands as a reminder that the war did not end in 1945. Its consequences were carried forward, transplanted onto American soil, woven into the foundations of Cold War science and technology. The silent atrocities of the Reich were not left behind in Europe. They were imported, legitimized, and celebrated under new flags. The victims remain voiceless, erased by the same system that promised to honor them. Their torment became a commodity, their pain a currency in the race for supremacy. To this day, the question lingers in the files. What price was paid for progress, and whose graves lie beneath the foundations of our triumphs? The war left behind monuments, medals, and myths of triumph, but beneath the surface, shadows linger. The documents unearthed from forgotten vaults, the testimony whispered across generations, and the censored photographs smuggled from ruins all point to truths deliberately concealed. Governments of both East and West forged narratives of victory, but they also forged silence. The siege of Leningrad was not only defiance, but cannibalism suppressed in NKVD files. Harbin was not just occupation, but the frostbitten limbs of Unit 731's victims repurposed as Cold War assets. Ravensbrück was not only resistance broken by the SS, but a medical theatre of mutilation where survivors were catalogued as used up. And America's rocket program was not only Apollo's ascent, but the rebranding of Nazi war criminals under the name of Operation Paperclip. Each fragment reveals a pattern. The most disturbing chapters of the war were not destroyed by fire, but buried by deliberate omission. The silence was not accidental. It was engineered, reinforced by intelligence agencies, by political necessity, by the fear that full disclosure would unravel the carefully woven fabric of post-war stability. And yet fragments survive, enough to remind us that the war's darkest secrets remain unresolved. For every file unsealed, there are 10 still stamped top secret. For every testimony remembered, 1,000 were silenced. The question that remains is not only what happened, but what has been withheld, and how many more truths, more atrocities, lie waiting in the locked drawers of archives, forbidden to see the light of day.